Answer this correctly, or don't bother coming back tomorrow, Daniel Whitmore said without looking up from his watch, his voice calm but sharp enough to silence the low hum of conversation across the dining room. And for a moment, even the clinking of glasses seemed to hesitate, as if the entire restaurant understood that something invisible had just shifted. Emily Carter stood still, order pad in hand, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, the soft glow of the overhead lights catching in her eyes but revealing nothing beneath. And while anyone else might have rushed to respond or stumbled over an apology, she simply met his gaze for half a second, then nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if he had just asked for something entirely ordinary. Daniel finally looked up, expecting hesitation, expecting uncertainty, expecting the small cracks he had learned to spot in people within seconds. But there was none, just a quiet stillness that unsettled him more than defiance ever could. Around them, a few guests leaned subtly in their seats, sensing tension without understanding it, drawn to the contrast between the man who owned half the skyline and the woman who refilled water glasses without being noticed. Emily turned slightly, placing the glass she had been holding back onto the table with careful precision, not rushed, not delayed, just exact. And in that small motion, there was something controlled, something measured, something that didn't quite belong to someone in her position. Daniel tapped his fingers once against the polished surface in front of him, a habit born from years of negotiations where silence was currency and pressure was strategy. But this time, the silence didn't bend the way it usually did. It held, steady and unmoved. "Well," he said, a faint edge creeping into his tone, not impatience, but curiosity sharpened by something he couldn't yet name. Emily's voice, when it came, was soft, even, almost neutral. "If that's your condition, sir, then I'll accept it." And she didn't say anything more, didn't ask for clarification, didn't negotiate. And that was the moment something flickered behind Daniel's composed exterior, because acceptance without resistance wasn't part of the pattern he understood. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her now, really studying her, noticing the way her hands didn't tremble, the way her breathing stayed steady, the way her attention seemed to stretch beyond him, taking in the room, the timing, the rhythm of everything around them. This wasn't compliance, not really, and he felt it in the subtle shift of control he couldn't quite explain. Somewhere near the bar, a glass was set down too hard, breaking the fragile quiet. But neither of them reacted, locked instead in a moment that felt longer than it should have been. Daniel gave a small, almost amused smile, the kind he used when he believed he had already won. "Good," he said, his tone smoothing out again, confident, assured. "Then let's see what you can do." But as Emily inclined her head once more and turned slightly to prepare, there was a brief, almost imperceptible glance in her eyes, not toward him, but past him, as if she had already calculated something he hadn't even realized was part of the game. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore felt the faintest hint of something unfamiliar pressing against the edges of his certainty. Not doubt exactly, not yet, but something quieter, deeper, and far more dangerous. The possibility that he had just set the rules of a game he didn't fully understand. Daniel did not speak immediately after she accepted, and that in itself was unusual, because he was a man who filled silence with intention, who shaped rooms with a single sentence. Yet now he simply watched as Emily moved with quiet efficiency toward the service station, her steps unhurried, her focus intact, as if his challenge had already been placed somewhere inside a larger framework she understood better than he did. He adjusted his cuff slightly, the subtle gleam of his watch catching the light, a small ritual he used to regain control, and then he leaned forward just enough for his voice to carry without rising. "I will make it simple," he said, though nothing about his tone suggested simplicity. "You have 5 minutes to present a recommendation that I would actually consider. Not something from a textbook, not something you heard someone else say, something real, something useful, something that proves you are worth more than the uniform you are wearing." And there it was, the line drawn clearly now, the rules defined, the expectations set. A few tables nearby had gone noticeably quieter, not because anyone wanted to intrude, but because the weight of the moment pulled attention like gravity. Emily picked up a pen from the counter, not her own, one left behind by another server, and turned it once between her fingers, a small, almost absent gesture, before glancing toward the large window at the front of the restaurant where the late afternoon light stretched long across the polished floor, and for a second, it seemed as if she was not thinking about his question at all, but about something else entirely, something further away. Daniel noticed, and his lips pressed together slightly, interpreting the pause as hesitation, as delay, as the beginning of a mistake. He had seen it countless times, the moment when pressure began to fracture confidence, when people reached for answers they did not fully understand, and he expected it now, almost welcomed it, because it would confirm what he already believed. Time is already moving, he added, tapping the table once, not loudly, but enough to mark the passing seconds. Emily looked back at him then, not quickly, not defensively, just with the same steady gaze, and she gave a small nod as if acknowledging a fact rather than responding to pressure, and then she spoke. Then I will not waste it. Her voice even, controlled, and without a trace of urgency. She stepped closer to the table, placing the pen down beside his untouched glass, aligning it perfectly with the edge as if it belonged there, as if it had always been part of the setting. And Daniel felt something shift again, something subtle but undeniable, because instead of reacting to his structure, she was creating her own. He leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other, watching her now with sharper attention, not as a server, but as a variable he had not yet categorized. Emily's eyes moved briefly across the table, the menu, the receipt folder, the arrangement of items, and then back to him. And in that quiet scan there was calculation, not rushed, not forced, just precise. You are not asking for information, she said calmly. You are asking for judgment. And the words landed softly, but they carried weight, enough that Daniel's fingers paused against the table for a fraction of a second. She did not continue immediately, did not rush to fill the space, allowing the observation to settle, to exist on its own. And around them, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath again, not because of volume, but because of presence. Daniel's expression remained composed, but there was a faint narrowing of his eyes now, not irritation, not yet, but focus, the kind that came when something did not unfold as expected. Then judge, he replied, his voice lower, more deliberate. But this time, there was something beneath it, something less certain than before, something that did not quite align with the confidence he had started with. And as Emily met his gaze without hesitation, without any visible shift in her posture or tone, it became clear, even if only in the smallest way, that the balance between them was no longer exactly where he thought it was. Emily did not answer immediately, and that pause was not hesitation but placement, as if she was setting each word before allowing it to exist, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, not gripping, not fidgeting, simply present. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm weight. Then I will give you something you cannot measure in 5 minutes. And the statement was not defiant, not challenging, just factual, and that alone caused a subtle shift in Daniel's posture, his shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly as if he had expected resistance, but not this quiet redirection. He studied her more carefully now, noticing details he had dismissed before, the steadiness in her breathing, the absence of urgency in her movements, the way she seemed entirely unaffected by the attention gathering around them. And for the first time, he realized she was not performing for the room. She was not even performing for him. She was simply responding on her own terms. You are still avoiding the task, he said, though his tone had changed, less commanding, more probing, as if he was trying to locate the edge of something he could not yet define. Emily tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in consideration. No, she replied. I am clarifying it. And she reached for the pen she had placed beside his glass, sliding it a fraction of an inch, aligning it again even though it had not moved, a small action that carried an unexpected precision, as if she was demonstrating something without stating it directly. Daniel's gaze followed the movement, then returned to her face, his expression tightening, because now he could feel it clearly, the shift in control, subtle but undeniable, like a conversation that had changed direction without permission. You want something useful, Emily continued, her voice steady. But usefulness depends on context, and you have not given one. And she let the words settle, not pressing them forward, not forcing a reaction, just allowing them to exist between them. Daniel leaned forward again, slower this time, his fingers no longer tapping, his attention fully anchored. Then assume one, he said, though there was a trace of something new beneath his confidence, something that sounded almost like caution. Emily met his gaze without hesitation, and for a brief moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into something distant, irrelevant. If I assume, she said quietly, then I would be guessing what matters to you. And if I guess wrong, the answer becomes useless, not because it lacks value, but because it does not align with what you actually need. And there it was, the distinction placed carefully, deliberately, and Daniel felt it land deeper than he expected, not as a challenge, but as a mirror. He exhaled slowly, though he did not realize he had been holding his breath, and his eyes narrowed slightly, not in irritation, but in recognition, because this was no longer about the answer he had demanded. It was about the question he had failed to define. Emily's hands remained still now, resting lightly against the table, her posture unchanged, her presence unwavering. And in that stillness there was a quiet confidence that did not seek approval, did not seek validation, it simply existed. So, she said, her voice softer now, but no less precise, before I give you something you might consider valuable, you need to decide what you are actually asking for. And she did not move after that, did not step back, did not fill the silence, leaving the space entirely his. And for the first time since the exchange had begun, Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately, his mind moving through the implications of what she had just said, realizing, slowly, that the challenge he had set was no longer the one being tested, and that the confidence he had relied on so easily just minutes ago was now being examined in a way he had not anticipated, not by force, not by confrontation, but by something far more unsettling. The quiet precision of someone who understood the game well enough to let him reveal it to himself. Daniel did not expect to be the one thinking this long. Not in a situation he had created, not in a setting where he was used to controlling every variable down to the smallest detail. Yet now he sat there, silent, his gaze fixed on the woman standing across from him, as if the answer he had demanded had quietly turned back toward him, asking something in return. He straightened slightly, drawing in a measured breath. And when he spoke again, his voice was composed, but the certainty had shifted. Fine, he said, slower this time. Assume I want something that gives me an edge, something practical, something I can use immediately. And though the words sounded firm, there was a subtle adjustment in them, less absolute, more defined, as if he had taken her instruction seriously without fully realizing it. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharpened just slightly. As if the missing piece had finally been placed into position, she gave a small nod, acknowledging the clarity, and then she moved, not away, but closer by a single step, enough to shift the dynamic without drawing attention to it. Then I will give you something simple, she said, her voice calm, steady, but you will not like it. And that was the first time a faint reaction crossed Daniel's face, not offense, not irritation, but curiosity edged with something more cautious than before. Try me, he replied, though his tone no longer carried the same effortless dominance, because now there was something at stake that he could not quite define. Emily glanced briefly at the table again, her eyes moving over the untouched water, the perfectly aligned pen, the neatly folded receipt. Folder, and then back to him. And when she spoke, her words came measured, deliberate, each one placed with intention. You are looking for an advantage in answers, she said. But your real advantage comes from asking better questions. And she paused, not for effect, but because the sentence did not need anything more. It simply existed, clear and complete. Daniel's fingers shifted slightly against the table, a small movement that betrayed the impact more than any expression could, because it was not what he expected, not what he had prepared to evaluate. And for a brief second, he searched for a flaw, something to dismiss, something to challenge, but nothing presented itself immediately. That is obvious, he said finally, though the response felt thinner than he intended, lacking the weight it usually carried, and he knew at the moment the words left his mouth. Emily did not argue, did not correct him. She only tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. If it were obvious, she replied softly, you would not have started with a question that had no direction. And the words landed without force, without accusation, but with a precision that left no space to deflect them. The air between them shifted again, quieter now, heavier, as if something unspoken had settled into place. Daniel leaned back, slower this time, his posture no longer signaling control, but consideration. And for the first time since the conversation began, he looked away briefly, not in dismissal, but in thought, as if recalibrating something internal that had been slightly, but undeniably, disrupted. Emily did not move, did not press further, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her presence steady and unchanging. And in that stillness, it became clear that she was not trying to win anything. She was not proving herself. She was simply revealing something he had overlooked. When Daniel looked back at her, there was a difference in his eyes now, subtle but unmistakable, not defeat, not yet, but the beginning of something far more significant. The quiet realization that the ground beneath his confidence was no longer as solid as it had felt just moments ago, and that the challenge he had issued had already begun to turn in a direction he had not chosen. Daniel did not respond right away, and this time the silence was different, not strategic, not calculated, but reflective, as if something inside him had shifted just enough to make him pause before reaching for his usual certainty. He glanced briefly at the pen on the table again, then at the glass, then back at Emily, and there was a faint crease between his brows now, the kind that appeared when something did not align with his expectations. You are saying I asked the wrong question, he said finally, his tone quieter, less performative, as if the audience around them no longer mattered. Emily gave a small nod, not in agreement alone, but in acknowledgement of his willingness to say it out loud, and that detail did not escape him. Then what would have been the right one? He asked, and the shift was subtle, but unmistakable, because now he was not testing her, he was asking. Emily did not answer immediately, and once again, the pause carried intention, her eyes moving briefly toward the window where the light had softened into early evening tones, casting longer shadows across the room. And when she looked back, there was a quiet clarity in her expression. That depends on what you are actually trying to understand, she said, her voice steady. Because the right question is not about sounding impressive, it is about revealing something you do not already know. And she let the words settle, not forcing them forward. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back into his chair, his posture no longer rigid, no longer anchored in control, but in consideration, and for the first time, he seemed less concerned with how he appeared and more focused on what he was hearing. Most people try to give answers that sound valuable. Emily continued, her tone unchanged, but real value comes from seeing what others miss. And you cannot see clearly if you are asking from a position of assumption. And as she spoke, her hands remained still, her presence grounded, not pushing, not persuading, just stating something that felt undeniable. Daniel's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but inward, as if he was replaying the last few minutes, tracing back through his own words, his own approach, and finding the gaps he had not noticed before. A faint sound of movement from another table broke the stillness for a moment, but neither of them reacted, locked instead in a conversation that no longer needed an audience. So you would have asked something different, he said, and this time there was no edge, no challenge, just a genuine attempt to understand. Emily inclined her head slightly. Yes, she replied. I would have asked what problem you are actually trying to solve, not what answer you want to hear. And again, the distinction was small, but it carried weight, enough to shift the entire frame of the conversation. Daniel's fingers rested against the table now without movement, the earlier habit of tapping gone entirely, replaced by a stillness that mirrored her own. And in that stillness, something became clear to him, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, like a pattern. Coming into focus, he gave a quiet, almost imperceptible nod, more to himself than to her, and for a brief second, the confidence he had carried into the room felt different, not diminished, but examined, as if it had been placed under a light he had not expected. Emily did not add anything further, did not press for acknowledgement, did not seek validation. She simply remained as she was, calm, composed, and entirely unaffected by the shift she had created. And in that moment, Daniel realized something he had not anticipated when this began, that the most unsettling part was not that she had challenged him, but that she had done it without ever raising her voice, without ever stepping outside her role, and without ever making it about winning at all. Daniel remained still for a moment longer, his eyes no longer scanning for flaws, no longer searching for an angle to reclaim control, but instead settling into something unfamiliar, a kind of quiet awareness that did not demand immediate resolution. The ambient noise of the restaurant slowly returned around them, the soft murmur of conversations, the distant clink of cutlery, the low hum of music threading through the space. Yet it all felt distant, as if the moment between them existed slightly outside of it. He shifted in his seat, not with impatience, but with intention, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that could not be easily disguised. "Most people would have tried to impress me by now," he said, not as a compliment, not as a critique, but as an observation he was still processing. Emily's expression remained steady, but there was a faint softness in her eyes now, not directed at him specifically, but at the truth of the statement itself. "Most people are taught that being heard requires being loud," she replied quietly, "but that only works when the other person is not really listening." And she let the words settle with the same calm precision she had maintained from the beginning. Daniel's lips pressed together slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition, because there was something in that sentence that reached further than the conversation at hand, something that connected to patterns he had seen in boardrooms, negotiations, and conversations that felt suddenly incomplete in hindsight. He leaned forward again, but this time the movement was slower, deliberate, as if he was stepping into a space he had not intended to enter when this began. "And you think I am not listening?" he said, though the tone lacked accusation, carrying instead a genuine curiosity that had not been there before. Emily did not rush to answer, her gaze holding his for a brief moment before shifting slightly, not away, but through, as if she was considering the question in its full context rather than reacting to its surface. "I think you are used to listening for advantage," she said. Finally, her voice even, not for understanding. And once again, the words were simple, but they landed with a quiet weight that did not need emphasis. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back once more, and this time there was no immediate response, no attempt to redirect, no effort to regain the upper hand. Just a moment of stillness where the truth of what she had said settled into place. He glanced briefly at the room around them, at the people engaged in their own conversations, their own concerns, and for a brief second, the distance between his world and theirs felt more noticeable than it had just minutes ago. When his gaze returned to Emily, there was something different there, not uncertainty exactly, but a kind of recalibration, as if the framework he had relied on was being quietly adjusted. "So what would understanding look like?" he asked, and the question itself marked a shift, subtle but undeniable, because it no longer sought to test her, it sought to learn. Emily's posture did not change, her hands resting lightly against the side of the table, her presence grounded in the same calm certainty. "It would look like asking a question you are willing to be wrong about," she said, and she did not elaborate, did not soften the statement, allowing it to stand on its own. Daniel's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, not in tension, but in thought. And for the first time since the exchange began, he did not have an immediate response, no prepared counter, no refined statement to regain control. Just a quiet moment where he understood that the conversation had moved beyond the boundaries he had set, and that the confidence he had carried into it had not been broken by force, but by something far more disarming. The steady presence of someone who never tried to compete with it at all. Daniel did not move right away, and for the first time, the stillness around him was not something he controlled, but something he stepped into, almost carefully, as if any sudden motion might break the clarity that had begun to form. His gaze remained on Emily, but it was different now, no longer measuring, no longer evaluating, but observing with a kind of focus that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with understanding. The restaurant carried on around them, conversations rising and falling, a server passing behind Emily with a tray of drinks, the faint sound of laughter from across the room, yet none of it seemed to touch the space they occupied. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, his hand moving toward the glass of water before him. not out of habit, but as if he needed a moment to ground himself. And when he set it back down, the motion was slower than before, more deliberate. "You have done this before," he said, his voice quieter, not accusing, not even fully certain, but searching for confirmation of something he could not quite name. Emily's expression did not change, but there was a subtle pause before she answered, as if she was deciding how much of the truth to place into the moment. "I have had conversations," she replied simply, and the understatement carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Daniel let out a faint breath, almost a quiet laugh, but without amusement, more like recognition, because he understood now that what was happening was not accidental, not spontaneous, but intentional in a way he had underestimated. "You let me set the terms," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in realization, "and then you changed them without saying a word." And this time, the statement was not a challenge, it was an acknowledgement. Emily's gaze held his steadily, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something softer in her expression, not satisfaction, not victory, but a quiet confirmation that he was beginning to see. "You set the surface," she said, her voice calm. "But the direction was always yours to choose," and she did not elaborate further, allowing the implication to settle on its own. Daniel leaned back slowly, his posture no longer defined by control, but by a kind of thoughtful release, as if he had stepped out of a role he had been playing without realizing it. He looked down briefly at the table, at the pen, at the small details that now seemed more deliberate than they had minutes ago, and then back at her. And there was no trace of dismissal left in his expression, only a quiet intensity that felt different. "So this was never about the answer," he said, more to himself than to her, and the realization carried through his tone, not as defeat, but as clarity. Emily did not confirm it, did not deny it. She simply remained still, her presence unchanged, allowing him to arrive at the conclusion without interference. A moment passed, longer than it should have been, but neither of them seemed to notice. And then Daniel nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if accepting something he had not expected to confront when he walked into the room. "And if I had asked the right question," he continued, his voice steady now, "you would have given me a different answer." And there was no challenge in it, only curiosity. Emily inclined her head slightly. "Yes," she said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else she had said so far, because it confirmed what he was beginning to understand, that the outcome had never been fixed, that the direction had always been shaped by his own choices. Daniel's fingers rested against the table once more, but there was no tension in them now, no urgency, just a quiet stillness that mirrored the shift within him. And in that stillness, it became clear that whatever confidence had been present at the beginning had not been taken from him. It had been reframed, examined, and in doing so, transformed into something far more uncertain and far more real. Daniel let the silence stretch, not because he did not have anything to say, but because for the first time, he understood that speaking too quickly would only return him to the same patterns he had just recognized, and that awareness alone held him still. His eyes moved once more across the table, the small details that now felt intentional rather than incidental, the precise alignment of the pen, the untouched glass, the quiet symmetry of everything within reach, and he realized, slowly, that nothing in this exchange had been rushed, nothing had been accidental, not even the pauses. When he looked back at Emily, there was no trace of the earlier distance between them, no barrier of status or assumption, only a directness that felt unfamiliar in its simplicity. "You knew," he said, his voice low, steady, not accusing, but acknowledging something he had only just begun to understand. "You knew exactly where this would go." And for a moment, it seemed like a question, but it was not. It was recognition. Emily did not answer right away, her gaze holding his without pressure, without urgency. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity it always had. "I knew how it could go," she said, "but not how you would choose to take it." And the distinction was subtle, but it mattered, and he felt it immediately. Daniel gave a small nod, absorbing the implication, because it meant that nothing had been forced, nothing had been predetermined, that every shift, every realization, had been shaped by his own responses, his own decisions. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table now, without tension, without the need to signal control. So, the challenge, he said slowly, was never really mine. And this time, there was a faint trace of something else in his tone, not frustration, not defeat, but a kind of quiet respect forming beneath the surface. Emily's expression softened just slightly, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. It started as yours, she replied. But it became something else the moment you decided to stay in it. And once again, she did not elaborate, allowing the meaning to unfold on its own. Daniel's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not the confident, practiced version he had worn before, but something smaller, more genuine, as if he had found something unexpected in a place he had not thought to look. He glanced briefly around the room again, noticing now the rhythm of the space, the way people moved, the way conversations flowed without the need to dominate or control them, and for a brief moment, it all felt different, as if he was seeing it through a lens he had not used before. When his attention returned to Emily, there was no longer any question of who held the upper hand, because the idea itself had become irrelevant. "Then answer me this," he said, but this time, the words carried none of the earlier weight of a test, none of the pressure of a demand, only a quiet curiosity that felt entirely genuine. "What would you have done if I had walked away?" And the question lingered between them, not as a challenge, but as a reflection of everything that had just taken place. Emily considered it for a brief moment, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and when she answered, her voice was soft, but certain. "Nothing," she said, and the simplicity of it held more meaning than any complex explanation could have. Daniel's brow lifted slightly, not in confusion, but in realization, because he understood now what she meant, that the conversation, the shift, the outcome, had only existed because he had chosen to remain, to engage, to listen. He leaned back slowly, exhaling a quiet breath, and in that moment, it became clear to him that whatever had been unsettled within his confidence had not been taken away. It had been revealed, reshaped, and placed into a context he could no longer ignore. And as the faint smile remained at the corner of his lips, there was a quiet acceptance in it, not of defeat, but of something far more rare, the recognition that sometimes the most powerful shift does not come from winning a challenge, but from understanding why it was never about winning at all. Daniel sat there a moment longer after her answer, the words still echoing in his mind, not because of its simplicity, but because of what it revealed about everything that had just happened. "Nothing," she had said, and somehow that carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it stripped away the illusion that this moment had been engineered or controlled by anything other than his own choice to remain. He let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the last light of the evening had softened into a quiet glow, reflecting faintly against the glass and stretching across the polished floor. And for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, he was not thinking about outcomes, not calculating angles, not measuring value. He was simply present. When he looked back at Emily, there was no trace of the earlier distance, no need to assert, no need to test, only a quiet clarity that had settled into place. "I see it now," he said, his voice low, not for effect, not for the room, but because anything louder would have felt unnecessary. It was never about proving anything, and he paused, not because he was unsure, but because he was choosing his words with a care he rarely applied. "It was about whether I was willing to listen long enough to understand what I was asking, and the realization did not land with force. It settled, steady and undeniable." Emily did not respond immediately, her posture unchanged, her presence as calm as it had been from the beginning, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same quiet certainty. "Most people do not stay that long," she said, and there was no judgment in it, no praise, just a simple observation of how things usually unfolded. Daniel gave a small nod, a faint smile touching the corner of his lips again, not the practiced kind, but something quieter, more genuine. "I almost did not," he admitted, and the honesty in it surprised even him, because he was not used to admitting the moments where he might have walked away. The sounds of the restaurant moved around them again, more noticeable now, as if the world had gently returned after holding its breath, and Daniel reached for the pen on the table, turning it once between his fingers before setting it back down exactly where she had placed it, aligning it without thinking. And the small action carried a quiet recognition of everything she had shown him without ever stating it directly. "What would you ask?" he said after a moment, his tone thoughtful, not demanding, not testing, but genuinely curious. "If you were in my position." And this time, the question did not seek to prove anything. It simply sought direction. Emily considered him for a brief second, her eyes steady, and then she answered, "I would ask what I am not seeing." And she did not add anything more, did not explain, because the simplicity was enough. Daniel nodded slowly, the answer settling into place with a clarity that felt both new and obvious at the same time. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy, no longer tense, but balanced, complete in a way that did not require filling. He reached for his wallet, placing a card inside the check folder with a motion that was quiet, almost absent, and then he stood, not abruptly, not with the sharp precision he had entered with, but with a steadiness that felt different. "Thank you, Emily," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried something more than courtesy, something closer to respect, the kind that was not given lightly. And as he turned to leave, he paused just long enough to glance back once, not to reclaim anything, not to add another word, but simply to acknowledge the moment before stepping away. Emily remained where she was, watching him go for a second before returning to her work with the same calm focus, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, and yet the space he left behind felt quieter, not because he was gone, but because something had shifted within it. And somewhere between the question